Great. If you haven't heard that, welcome everyone. My name's Emmanuel Givanakis. I'm the CEO here at the Financial Services Regulatory Authority here in Abu Dhabi Global Market. The United Arab Emirates Ministry of Finance has the responsibility for ensuring UAE institutions are compliant with the information exchange regimes under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act and the Common Reporting Standard. As part of its efforts, the Ministry of Finance is introducing a new platform to collect FATCA and CRS returns from all reportable financial institutions. To assist financial institutions in adapting to this new platform and fulfilling their reporting obligations effectively, the Financial and Cybercrime Prevention Unit of the FSRA has organised this awareness and training session. This session will help guide attendees on how to complete and submit their FATCA and CRS returns, including nil returns where applicable. By participating in this event, attendees will gain the necessary knowledge and skills to navigate the new platform that will assist you in completing your reporting obligations. I encourage active participation, so feel free to ask questions, share your experiences, and engage in fruitful discussions with our speakers and fellow participants. Together, we can deepen our understanding and collectively enhance our expertise in this crucial area of compliance. Without further ado, let us begin this training where we will unravel the nuances and best practices to ensure accurate and timely reporting. Thank you very much.
Very good morning to you and welcome. Just to echo some of Emmanuel's comments, welcome to this session. We will be covering the new anticipated FATCA and CRS system, which is being introduced by the Ministry of Finance. We'll also be pleased to answer any of your questions and take discussion points. The Ministry of Finance did host a session a few weeks ago on the new system, but I'm sure many of you have questions on how to register, how to report to this system. I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague today, Tara Assad. We're from PwC, and we're very pleased to be invited by the ADGM to host this session, and special thanks to Mike, Maha, and Greta for the invite. In terms of our agenda this morning, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go through, we'll recap some of the requirements for reporting financial institutions. It's always good to refresh on what institutions should be doing, the different types of classifications under both the regimes, and what the expectations are when it comes to the Ministry of Finance and these reporting regimes. We're then going to cover a session on registering to the new portal. So all reporting financial institutions in this room will need to register in this new portal. It's not the same portal as last year. You'll need to do a fresh registration. Then we'll break, and then we'll cover in detail the reporting templates. Reporting as per prior years, this year is through Excel. So Excel templates are effectively published by the Ministry of Finance in the portal. And institutions will need to complete those forms and ensure that their data is valid. And then we'll do a Q&A. I'm probably going to stop at the end of each section for a Q&A, just in case there are questions that come up. So please do raise your hand and we'll make sure the mic gets to you. Before I kick off with the content, I think it's worth kind of just reflecting on FATCA and CRS. So the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act and the Common Reporting Standard are probably now one of the more pivotal tools when it comes to combating tax evasion. Tax evasion today estimated at $1 trillion. And the OECD's estimate is the Common Reporting Standard has recovered approximately $140 billion of lost tax revenues through the CRS. So indeed, it's an effective tool. but it's not a perfect tool. And it relies on institutions doing the necessary due diligence, obtaining necessary information from account holders, and reporting that data to a complete and accurate manner. And that's really the purpose of today's discussion, to go over those requirements of the Ministry of Finance, and we're also pleased to answer any questions you might have on FATCA CRS. The ADGM, of course, is not a body to give you tax or legal advice. We'll be giving no opinions today or tax advice from PwC, but we're happy to answer any questions that are operational in nature, refer to some of the obligations of institutions, and perhaps some of the different classifications. I know there are different businesses here with different licensing categories. Under the CRS particularly, there's been a huge exchange of information push. 111 billion euros of accounts has been exchanged last year, covering approximately 1 trillion euros in terms of value. That's been across 120 jurisdictions. The UAE is a jurisdiction which is non-reciprocal, so the UAE shares data with approximately 80 countries, but does not receive any data. That may indeed change now, given the UAE corporate tax law has now been enacted and ratified. FATCA, again, a renewed interest by the IRS. So if you go on the IRS's website, FATCA is a completely refreshed idea, a completely new campaign around FATCA. So we'll certainly see more from the IRS as time goes on under the FATCA regime. What's coming on the horizon? There are amendments to the CRS on the horizon expected in 2024, so the regime will be changing. There's a new regime called the Crypto Asset Reporting Framework, which is due to come around 2024, 2025, which includes new reporting requirements for businesses in that space. So we'll do a very kind of brief recap on some of the RFI definitions and requirements. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this. All ADGM entities, FSRA or not, in fact, all entities around the world will have a classification under these regimes. And that's either a financial institution, or under FATCA, a foreign financial institution, or a non-financial institution, or NFE or NFFE. So all institutions in the ADGM are required to classify themselves under these rules. And then for financial institutions, there's either reporting financial institutions or non-reporting. You may be non-reporting by virtue of some type of exemption. And under the NFE and the NFFE categories, there's active and passive. Now, the way the legislation's been written, institutions must assess whether they are financial institutions first. You can't simply categorize yourself as an active or a passive by virtue of meeting those requirements. You must assess if you're an FI first. If you're not an FI, then the active categories are fully well defined, documented, and if you're not an active NFE, you're by default passive. Passive doesn't really have any definition under the rules. And if you're a reporting financial institution, that's where you have obligations to report, and that report might be an account report where you report on your account holders, or it may be some form of nil return, both of which you'll be able to do through this new system. Non-reporting financial institutions, broadly speaking, don't have reporting requirements, and although you may have some types of registered deemed compliant FFIs under FATCA, where you do have a GIN, and you may need to file some kind of return or nil return to the ministry. So that's, broadly speaking, just the categories under the regime. Now, what do you need to do if you're a reporting financial institution? Effectively, there are two requirements. One, you need to file a return by the stipulated deadline. All deadlines for FATCA and CRS are stipulated by the Ministry of Finance. As we stand here today, it's 30th of June. That's the official deadline. But there may be some form of extension because the system has not been implemented yet. It's not been issued. Portal's not open. And two, you need to submit a risk assessment. So a risk assessment self-certification must be submitted through the system, one for FATCA and one for CRS. and that determines, kind of informs the regulatory authority of your risk rating, and that information is also shared with the Ministry of Finance. And that may inform some follow-up questions or further due diligence into your institution's activities. One thing I actually wanted to talk about was why are there all these new requirements? Why more audit? Why more risk? Why ask all these questions? And it simply comes down to the quality of data. CRS and FATCA have been around for a very long time now. FATCA 2014, CRS in the UAE 2017. So quite some time, data's been exchanged between countries. And as countries begin to look at this data, it transpires that a lot of the data they're not able to match. The main purpose of these regimes was effectively to identify tax residents who are not paying the right amount of tax, who are not declaring assets in their home jurisdiction, and it's transpired that a lot of the data that's been exchanged over the last few years has not been of sufficient quality where those tax administrations can use it. So what you'll probably expect now going forward is a huge focus on data quality, particularly things like tax identification numbers, and there'll be some quite strict enforcement around ensuring that institutions are doing that completely and fully. We've actually got two slides. So thinking about institutions or ADGM businesses that maintain financial accounts. So if you have financial accounts, there's a few more steps you need to do. Going from left to right, everyone needs to register. So you'll need to register for the new portal. The portal, again, is not live at the moment. The Ministry of Finance will release the link to be able to access it. There are training materials already on the webpage. The FAQ's been issued on the webpage, so everyone's able to access that, just not the portal yet. You'll need to have a governance framework in place for FATCA and CRS. That's absolutely mandatory. So policies, procedures, training materials, documenting your position and your treatment of account holders. You need to identify which account holders are reportable. So reviewing your account holders or customers, collecting documentation, determining tax residency or US status, onboarding and due diligence, so ensuring that you're in compliance with all those requirements under the legislation. Monitoring for a change in circumstance is pretty much one that everyone misses. So ensuring that monitoring for change in tax residency, and that can be driven by a number of factors: a change in address, a change in something simple as a telephone number of your customer. The regulatory authority will be monitoring and ensuring that businesses are doing that in a robust manner. And then eventually reporting. So submitting your report in the system. We're going to go through the system and the functionality in the system and how it all works. But that's something that you all need to do by the deadline. Otherwise, there are some quite strict enforcement actions that will be taken against firms that don't report on time. So not so dissimilar for those without. So here we're talking about investment managers, investment advisors. If you don't maintain financial accounts, you still need to register. You still need to file a return. You still need to have documentation in place talking about your attitude towards FATCA and CRS, why you don't have reportable accounts, etc. And then filing a nil return. So nil returns in the UAE are mandatory. You need to submit those by the deadline. Otherwise, it's pretty much a missed filing. So, and then at the end, we got comply with any regulatory requests. This is audit assessments, anything to do with risk, any questions you might have from the regulator. There are a lot of requests coming both from different countries and from the Ministry of Finance. So those are continuously raised to the ADGM, and those need to be answered in a timely manner. I'm actually just going to pause there before we go into the system, just to see if anyone's got any questions on the content so far. We have one here. Oh, so you need to file both. So if you're a reporting financial institution, if that's your classification, for FATCA you'll generally have a GIN, a global intermediary number, and for CRS, you don't have a GIN. There's no need for a GIN. So if you fall into the rules, if you fall into the classification of a reporting financial institution for FATCA and CRS, you'll have to apply for a GIN and you'll have to register into this portal. Yeah. Any other questions? No, I think we're good to go. Okay, so moving on to the portal. So probably just a few things up front before we get into the portal itself. Number one, this is a brand new portal being implemented by the Ministry of Finance. It's not something that's been implemented or being implemented by the ADGM. The Ministry of Finance is the competent authority for FATCA CRS in the UAE, and they will be hosting the portal. So all institutions across the UAE will be reporting into this portal. The second thing is it's not live, so don't worry if you can't access it because it's not live yet and no one has a link to it. So it'll be coming out soon. We don't know when. We've not been instructed by the Ministry of Finance yet, but I would hazard a guess probably very shortly. And the third thing is it's none of your registrations or logins from any previous systems will be used in this one. So it's a completely new registration. There was a system last year for FATCA and CRS. The same login, all those details do not exist in this system. It will be a completely fresh registration. Probably talking about sort of some of the steps, and I think this is quite important because a lot of people will need to kind of focus on this and when they first register in the system. The first step is login via UAE Pass. So there is no separate login for this system. There's no two-factor authentication. There's none of that technology. It's all through UAE Pass. What does that mean? That means anyone that wants to use the system has to be registered with UAE Pass. So if you're not registered with UAE Pass, you need to register with UAE Pass if you're going to use this system. And once the link goes live on the Ministry of Finance webpage, first thing when you click in that will happen is the UAE Pass login will come up. So you'll need to have a UAE Pass login. Now, UAE Pass is possible for obviously for UAE residents. It's also possible for visitors to the UAE, and it's also possible to register for UAE Pass if you're outside of the UAE. So if you have compliance colleagues who are not in the UAE, they don't have a UAE telephone number, etc., that shouldn't be an issue. They're still able to register for UAE Pass. So UAE Pass is open to all users for this system. And when you log into the system and you put in your UAE Pass, the first user, so as soon as you log in, you're an admin user. There's nothing in the system, it's blank, it's empty. And the first thing you're going to want to do is create a group. Now we'll go through some of the screenshots, but I just want to kind of just go through conceptually how it works. You create a group, and groups effectively house entities. So if you have different entities across your business, you would create a group and you can put all those entities into that group. Or you can create several groups and put different entities into different groups. We'll talk about why that is. It's effectively just around user rights, but I'll go through that in more detail. As soon as the first admin user creates a group, they add users. So other people who are signed up to UAE Pass that have logged into the system effectively get added to those groups by the admin. And there's different user rights, so there's makers, checkers, viewers, or other admins. And the next step is to create entities. So you add entities into the solution, into the group. So you put the entity name, you put the GIN, you put their FATCA and CRS reporting obligations, all the pedigree details for the company, and you submit that. That submission goes to a checker user. So always in the system, there's maker checker functionality. It's effectively for a 4i review mandated by the Ministry of Finance. So all functions in the system will need to go through maker checker. The first admin user can be both a maker and a checker. So if they make, they can't check. If they can only check something they haven't made. That's how the functionality will work. And then you can add either only makers, only checkers. You can add other admins. For anyone to use the system to its fullest capability, you only need 2 users. The first user is the admin, the other one can be a maker and checker, or could be another admin. At the bare minimum, you need 2 users, and that's it. You can do everything in the system. Once you've submitted your institution, uploaded things like your trade license, perhaps your regulatory license, filled in all your details, that will go to the ADGM for approval. So the ADGM will be reviewing those applications, and they will either be rejected, upon which you'll need to do a completely new submission again. You can't amend a rejected submission, or it will be approved. And all these functions have got kind of email notifications and so on. So you'll be notified when something happens. Once it's been approved, you can make your submissions. Institution gets approved, you can go and submit your nil return or your annual return in the system. Again, the maker user needs to do that, and a checker user needs to approve it. Once it's been approved, you're effectively done. So that's the process that mostly everyone needs to follow. I'm sure it's not going to be that straightforward when it actually comes to it, but effectively that's the end-to-end process. If one person wanted to add another user, 2 users, 1 institution, submit a return, and you're done. And the portal will show you the different statuses of your returns, whether they're still pending, whether they've been submitted, whether all your obligations are completed. And this is effectively the same for the risk assessment. So your submission of data and risk assessment goes through a similar workflow for submissions. So I think there's already a question, so yeah, maybe I'll just take that now. Sure, go ahead. Sorry, can you, I think your mic's coming to you.
Last year, there was a problem with the phone numbers. We cannot use the one phone number for different login, but here the UAE pass can be used for, say, compliance professional who was working for 3 entities. So can I use the same UAE login pass for all 3 different entities?
So the UAE pass that you log in with, that's your user in the system. So you can, so effectively if you had 2 entities, the same UAE pass login can be an admin for both entities. That's not a problem.
Thank you.
That works. Any other questions? Not from different jurisdictions. So this is only for the UAE. Yes. So you can, yeah, absolutely. So number one, if you've got entities in different regulatory authorities, you can do that. If you've got central bank, for example, and ADGM, you can do that all in one group. That's not a problem. If you've got the same entity, which is regulated by 2 regulators, that's when you must use separate groups. So the same entity for different regulators can't be in the same group because they'll have the same GIN, for example. They'll have to have one group with central bank, create another group, and add ADGM, for example. So you can do that, but the only time you need separate groups is if you have the same entity with different regulators. Sorry? It works on your GIN, yeah. It's effectively based on your GIN plus your regulatory authority.
So just to be clear, you would have one group for one GIN, or can you have separate groups with the same GIN?
Yeah, so if you have one GIN, but you've got 2 regulators, so let's say it's the institution regulated by the ADGM and the central bank. Under that circumstance, you must use 2 groups. So you must separate that same GIN, different regulator, 3 different groups. The system won't let you use the same GIN within the same group twice. So you have to just create another group. Now, creating a group is easy. There's no approval process for groups. Users can create as many groups as they want. Nothing gets approved by the regulator because when you create a group, it's empty. So you can create as many groups as you want, and they won't do anything until you add entities into them. If entities have got different GINs, different trade license numbers, then you can house as many as you want into one group. But the only reason for the 2 group idea was effectively for institutions which are regulated by 2 regulators. So that's the main purpose for it. Otherwise, you don't need it. So if you're just one entity, or you have several entities with different regulators, you only really need one group. The only time you'd perhaps use different groups is if you want a segregation of responsibilities or users or something to that nature, then you can have separate groups. But broadly speaking, most users, based on the data that was seen last year, would be using one group effectively and putting all the entities into there. Any other questions just on this? We have one question up.
Good morning. My name's Ahmed from Rethink. My question is, apart from any incomplete required data or documents, what other reasons do you think ADGM will reject when registering for the application? When I'm looking at that flow chart at the bottom, before repeating step 4, what would be various few reasons ADGM would reject when submitting the registration?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to speak on behalf of the ADGM. I mean, so the data that's going into the system at the registration phase is relatively basic. So you're effectively submitting the details of your company and you're uploading some documentation. Now, the ADGM will check that against their records, and they'll ensure that that institution is registered with those persons, those documents, and so on. I think common reasons for rejection are probably when you've applied too many times. The system allows you to apply repeatedly, but if your registration is still pending with a regulator, any subsequent registrations might get rejected if your initial one's still pending. If any of your details are incorrect, of course, for example, something doesn't match your trade license number, documents don't seem to match up to the institution, contact names don't add up to the contact names registered with the ADGM. Could be various reasons. I mean, it's really up to the regulator to decide.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can
Yes.
now.
So let me address that question. My name is Mahal Boujermi, and I work under Financial and Cybercrime Prevention Department, looking after international tax matter. So one of the reasons we might reject an entity registering is if the information they are providing does not match the self-certification that is provided for ADGM. So you need to make sure that the classification you have selected at the portal is exactly the same one that you have on the self-certification. Should there be a change of circumstances that affect that change, you need to inform us before you report at the portal. So let's assume you are an investment entity. For some reason, you have received an advice from a tax advisor that you are no longer an investment entity, you are an active NFEs or a passive NFE or depository or a custodian. Because of that change, you need to inform us. You need to submit a new self-certification form. We need to review that, agree on your new change of circumstances, and then you can upload it on the system, and then you can choose that classification. Now, in regard to other information that you might put on the system, it could be the wrong GIN, because we have cases with entities, they have different GIN other than it was registered with us, so we need to check that as well. We also need to check the quality of the information that you have provided on the portal. Now, I understand that the portal will have some type of validation for the information. Nevertheless, we will also check it from our end just to make sure that the information you are providing is accurate. Now, the reason why we are conducting that is we don't want our entity under the remit of ADGM to receive any fine because of these issues. And it's not worth it, to be honest. Does that address the question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, we've got a few up here.
Hi. In case if the maker or a checker leaves the organization, would the admin be able to change the details for them? Or
Yeah.
will a re-registration be required for a maker and checker?
Yeah, so the admin will be able to add and remove as many makers and checkers as they want. So if someone leaves the organization, the admin just needs to log in, add additional makers and checkers, and effectively their user rights become active pretty much straight away. You can also add additional admins as well. So there doesn't need to just be one admin per group. You can add as many admins as you like. So a lot of institutions will probably decide to add a few additional users into the system so people are able to access and make filings in case the initial people can't. So, and that process of adding users doesn't require any approvals by the regulator or the Ministry of Finance. The users should simply be registered with UAE Pass. They have to be registered with the UAE Pass. If they're not, adding them will not work. So they have to firstly be registered with UAE Pass. As long as they're registered, you can add as many users as you'd like to any group. Users are assigned per group. So,
follow-up question.
Yeah.
So, is the registration very particular about the domain of the company, as in at soandso.com, or even any like Gmail or
Yeah.
Yahoo?
I thought you might ask that. So, but, I mean, a lot of you might have your UAE Pass with your kind of personal email address, Hotmail, Gmail, that sort of thing. So one thing, I mean, UAE Pass is effectively used for personal government services, paying your bills, etc. So when you first log into the system, using your personal credentials, if you use them to register with UAE Pass, the system will ask you if you want to use an alternative email address. Now that's your choice, it's your organization's choice if you want to do that. But as soon as you log in, it will ask you, would you like to assign an alternative email address to this portal? And then you can use your corporate one. And then once that's been done, you effectively use your corporate details to log into this system only. So UAE Pass will remain as is. It's just logging into the system using your personal details was obviously an issue in the beginning when the system was being developed. So a decision was taken by Ministry of Finance to allow an alternative email address to be assigned for the use of this system, and you can use your kind of professional email address then to log in. All users. So every single user, when you do your first login, it will ask you, do you want to use an alternative email address? If you don't do that, it will just use whatever's registered with the UAE Pass. If you do choose to do that, you'll need to use that to log in every time. So even if you just use your phone number, it's fine, but I think you do have an option to also use your email address when logging in via UAE Pass. So if you use your email address, you'd use the alternative one that you gave the system when you first logged in.
So when you're setting up the makers and the checkers, does it automatically link back to the UAE Pass original email address or the alternate email address?
Yeah, it's a good question. So basically, to be able to add makers and checkers, they need to first be registered with UAE Pass. And the recommendation is that they log in and set their email address. So if they set their email address as their professional email address, you'd effectively use that and add them onto it. So the key is to get the users right, I think, in the first place, set up their UAE Pass, do their alternative email addresses, then get the admin to log in. And anyone can be an admin. So if you logged into the system today, you would be the admin. If someone else logged in, they would be their own admin. But you can obviously then add others as makers and checkers to groups. So when they log in using their UAE Pass, that group will become visible to them. And they'd have a maker right over that group. So I think the recommended approach from Ministry of Finance is to set up the users first, do all the stuff around the alternative email addresses if needed, and then use that information to basically add people to groups. So I think we had another question up there. Sorry, I will come back to you. We just had another
thanks.
question up there.
So I wanted to ask about step 5. So basically, in terms of the review and approval of the entity, you had previously mentioned that one entity, of course, could be registered with a couple of regulators. So would both regulators need to do this approval?
Yeah, so if you have an entity, the same entity needs to report to 2 regulators, you would have to register that in the system twice. So as you do your initial registration to regulator 1, let's say, you'd complete that registration, that approval then would go to regulator 1. And then if you did your second one, that would have to be in another group. And that approval would go to regulator 2. So each regulator in turn will review the details you've submitted and either approve or reject.
Thanks.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so from what we understand from Ministry of Finance, that's not going to change anything to do with your UAE pass. So any settings you've got, any payments you're making through UAE pass, any of your personal stuff, let's say, should not get. I mean, according to the Ministry of Finance, should not get affected.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we'll keep going through the content. So I think I covered this already. I mean, the login through the UAE Pass, again, if you haven't signed up, very, very straightforward. Download the app on your phone. You can sign up using you just need your email address, telephone number, it goes through some authentication, your Emirates ID, and it pretty much signs you up. If you don't have an Emirates ID or any of those credentials, then visitors can use UAE Pass, or even people outside of the UAE can use UAE Pass. So if your colleagues are in different countries, you want to add users to review or to perform actions in the system, according to the Ministry of Finance, that should all be possible and should all be fine. And again, the last point effectively says you can add a correspondence email address for this system only. So that, and it's your choice to use that or not. It's up to your organization what you'd like to do. You can use your personal email address or you can use a correspondent email address. Okay, so when you first finally log into the system after doing all your UAE Pass stuff, the landing page, you don't see much. It's actually a blank page. I think they might change that in the future. But at the moment, it's a blank page. And what you kind of want to do is you effectively, the first thing you want to do is sort out your users offline. So to think about who your users are going to be in the system, who's going to be performing actions in the system. And then the first action you take is effectively adding groups. So add a new group. So creating a group, the first person that logs in is an admin. Like I said, anyone that logs into the system is an admin. So the first person who's effectively going to be responsible for creating groups and adding users, they should take the first actions in the system because they will be the admin in the system. You go to create groups. As I said, creating a group effectively allows you to house institutions or RFIs within that group. So if you have several entities that need to report, you can create one group and you can register everyone into the system. And you can create as many groups as you like. So if you want to put certain entities into certain groups, that will not make any difference at all. You can create groups on demand. There's no approval by the Ministry of Finance or the ADGM. And you can add as many users as you like. So that usability is all flexible, doesn't require any approval. It's all up to how you want to set it up, completely flexible. And then again, adding users, also super easy, just done through email address. Going back to the UAE Pass, if you used UAE Pass to effectively have an alternative or a correspondent email address, you would need to put that in here. And you basically just put the email address in, you add the user. That user will then immediately be able to log in and they'd be able to see that group. So it's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple. You can add several users at the same time. And there's different users that do different things. So admins effectively have rights to do everything. So they can make and check, but they can't check something they've made. And if they make, they can't check, another user needs to check. Makers only, so they can only file information, they can't review. Checkers only, they can't file, they can only review. And then viewers, so if you wanted someone in a review function who's not able to take any actions at all, there's also a view. Pretty much everyone, I think there's also a maker and checker user as well, it's not shown on the screenshot. But there is a maker and checker, so pretty much most people will effectively have an admin plus a maker and a checker. And between those two users, they'll be able to do everything in the system. It's a minimum of 2 users, that's the bare minimum, and through those 2 users, you'd effectively be able to make all your filings and making and checking all the filings through the system. Okay, so adding RFIs or adding institutions, also very, very easy. Once you've created a group, you can add an entity, and adding an entity effectively requires some information. So requires the regime you're reporting for. So is it FATCA or CRS, or is it both? You tick both. You'll need to add in your reporting classification. One thing to note is if you're an investment entity, you will need to determine which type of investment entity. So in the portal, there's two types of investment entities for CRS, effectively one under 6A of the legislation of Section 8 and 6B. So that's the difference between managed investment entities and non-managed investment entities. So you will need to disclose in the system which type you are. If you don't know that, you'll need to find that out before you register. You add your regulator, so for the ADGM, it'll be the ADGM. Your GIN becomes mandatory for FATCA. So if you're a FATCA reporting institution, the GIN box will change and it will become mandatory for US FATCA. It's obviously optional for CRS, you may not have one. And then the name of the entity. If you input a GIN, the name will be automatically populated from the IRS FFI list. If you're doing this only for CRS, you effectively put the name in. That's the entity name, the company name needs to go in there, not the name of the person filling this out. The GIN, so that's probably one thing that we came across last year. If you've recently registered for a GIN, you may not be able to report through this portal. The GIN list or the GIN library in this solution contains validation. So if it's not valid on the IRS portal, you won't be able to complete your registration. And if you've recently registered, it won't let you submit, it won't let you go forward. Remember, all the reporting we're doing this year is for calendar year 2022. So if you became a reporting institution in 2023, you don't need to report for calendar year 2022. Not even you don't need to, you just shouldn't be reporting. So it's only for calendar year 2022. If you are reporting FI in 2022, your GIN should be in the system, should all be available, you should be able to register. You'll need to put the date you became an RFI in the system. From what we understand, that drives some of the reporting obligations in the system in the various years and so on. So if you write 2023 in there, the system would not let you report for 2022. If you put 2022 or before, then it would allow you to report for 2022. Sure. Yeah, so you could do that. Yeah, the date that CRS went live or the date that kind of FATCA went live, it will ask you the questions for both of them. For the purposes of this system and what we've seen, you can only report for calendar year 2022 at the moment. So you can't report for any prior years as things stand. I would assume that the Ministry of Finance will probably build some sort of functionality around doing that. I think the other thing to note is the previous filings you've made through the old system, that's not going to be visible in this system, as far as we can see. So that data, you'll need to contact your regulator or the Ministry of Finance to access any of that or to make changes to any of that. Okay, sponsored sponsoring. This is effectively a FATCA concept. It's not CRS concept. Under the CRS, there's no kind of terminology when it comes to sponsored sponsoring, but there is under FATCA. And effectively, the IRS, back in 2014 now, created this concept called sponsored sponsoring. So one entity, it doesn't even need to be a financial institution, can sponsor other financial institutions. And the benefit of that is they effectively make one filing, they have one GIN, and they register all these details in the IRS portal. Now, a few years ago, this changed, and effectively what changed is all sponsored entities also had to obtain GINs from the IRS, in which case the entire sponsored sponsoring concept became a bit irrelevant because the same amount of work was needed for both. But there are many sponsored sponsoring institutions in the UAE. According to the IRS database, I think there's over 100. So this might be relevant for some people in the room. You're able to register these details in the system. So effectively, the sponsored entity would be the RFI. That would be, and in a classical example, that's the fund. A sponsoring entity, it could be anyone in the group. It could be any entity at all. It doesn't even need to be an RFI. Sponsoring entities need to be registered with the IRS, and they're given certain GINs or certain types of GINs depending on their obligations. On this screen particularly, if you're sponsoring and you're trying to register, the entities which are sponsored, the RFIs would need to enter their GIN here. And then on the next page, I don't think we show it in here actually, on the next page it would just ask for it would actually auto-populate all the details of the sponsor. So anything to do with sponsoring is all possible through the portal. You would effectively just do it through populating the GIN or the sponsored entity or the sponsored fund or the sponsored branch, whatever it is. And then when you press next, it would automatically recognize that and it would fill in the details of the sponsor. You just needed to check that and validate it before it gets submitted. So that's one sort of nuance to be aware of.
Sorry, one quick question, if you don't mind going back to the previous slide, one before that. Yeah, so are these the only regulators?
Where are you? Oh, there you
sorry. Are these the only regulators that are going to be listed?
Yes.
Because it's missing a few, like the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority of Dubai.
So that will all go under non-financial regulated.
Okay.
So if you're not any of those four, so if you're not central bank, DIFC, ADGM, ESCA, you'd go under non-financial regulated.
Okay.
That doesn't mean you're not financial regulated. You might be, but just by another regulator.
Okay, understood.
The reason for that is the distinction between the roles and responsibilities of the regulators. I think there's Cabinet Resolution 93, which gave the basically the split of responsibilities between regulatory authorities. And effectively, any institutions that are not central bank, ESCA, DIFC, ADGM will come under the remit of the Ministry of Finance, and that's administered by the Federal Tax Authority, the FTA.
So in terms of the workflow that you had previously presented, right, referring back to number 5, in that case, where would it go? Would it go to the Ministry of Finance for approval?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So anything around kind of registration, approvals, etc., would all go to Ministry of Finance. Anything related to audits and enforcement would go to the Federal Tax Authority.
Right. Okay. I mean, given that we're on June 5 already and all of this is pending, like what's the realistic timeline on when we would need to file all of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, so this statutory deadline, as things stand, is still 30th of June.
Right.
So that there's been no other announcement by the Ministry of Finance. I would be very surprised if it wasn't extended any further. I mean, institutions are going to need time to register, get their UAE pass going, get kind of adding users, adding entities, all the approval process as well. So I don't know, Maha, whether you want to add anything to that, but that, as things stand. It's still off.
Know how to use this.
Oh, there you go.
So unfortunately, under the ADGM, we don't have any visibility on the deadline. I don't think it will be the 30th of June. I think even if they put it as the 30th of June, us as the ADGM, we will try to negotiate with the Ministry of Finance to provide further timeline for our institution. That's all I have to say on the deadline.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, look, the deadline's obviously set by the ministry as the competent authority. I mean, the ministry needs to sort of sort and prepare the data before exchange. At the moment, yeah, there's no formal announcement, but I wouldn't be surprised if that probably changes over the course of the next week or two. Okay. Any other questions? I'm trying to remember where I was now. I think I was here. I think it's another.
If we have multiple entities in the group reporting to different regulators, should we be creating different groups, or is it okay to have one group for multiple regulators?
Yeah, so that's all fine in one group. So one group, different entities, different regulators can all be done in the same group. The only time you'll need two groups by necessity is effectively the same entity to two different regulators. So you will have to house them into different groups, and that's been clarified by Ministry of Finance.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions before we move on? No. Okay. Okay, so this is a bit of a strange one because it does contradict what I said earlier around RFIs only needing to join and non-RFIs not needing to do anything. But there is an exception to that. If requested by the ADGM, you may need to record your status into the system, be that active NFE, passive NFE, non-reporting financial institution. You will receive more comms from the ADGM around this if this is required. In the past, and I don't know if Maha wants to say anything now, but what I will say is, in the past, you've obviously been submitting this data to the ADGM. It's your responsibility to check that you've classified your institution in the right manner. But the ADGM may use the system going forward to capture some of that data.
Just
You can use this one if you like.
Okay, let me emphasize on one thing. This outreach session has been designed only for reporting financial institution. So whoever received the invite has been identified by the ADGM that a reporting financial institution. I do not see how you are an active NFE or passive NFEs and you are joining with us today in this room. Unless there is, of course, a change of circumstances that you need to notify us as a regulator.
Okay, so I'll skip this slide then. Okay, so approval by checkers, so kind of adding, so talking about sort of adding RFIs. So now you've logged into the system, all your users have registered for UAE Pass, you've created a group, you've added users to that group, you might even just add one user, so there's two of you in total. Then the next step you'll have to do is to add RFIs. Now, again, going back to the maker checker functionality, the maker or the initial user creating the RFI will not be able to check. So we just had a lot of questions around this, and the system kind of doesn't really make it that obvious that you don't have certain kind of permissions to do certain things. But effectively, if you're the admin and you create an entity or an RFI, it must require a checker user to approve that RFI. As per the kind of functionality or workflow in the system, a checker can refuse something, but they can reject it with comments. The maker's then able to view those comments. Checkers are not able to make changes whilst they're reviewing. They have to send things back to makers, and then makers are able to make edits and resubmit the information to checkers. Once the checker has approved the RFI effectively then goes directly to the regulator. So in your case, it will go to the ADGM, upon which it would undergo a review process. That might take some time. And once that's either approved or rejected, you will be notified by email. If you're approved, happy days. You don't need to do anything else. You can go in the system, you can report. If it's rejected, you'll be notified why it's been rejected. You won't be able to resubmit that application again, but you can create a new application correcting whatever was noted down. In the system, it will kind of show different colors and different alerts around something that's pending with the regulator or pending with the checker or whatever the sort of status is, or approved by the checker, all those sort of statuses are in the system. We're not going to go through them now. But you'll be able to tell in the system what stage an RFI is at. Before anything has been approved, you're not able to submit anything. So you won't be able to submit any of your returns, even in draft. That's not going to be possible. What you will be able to do is you'll be able to access the Excel file, the upload file. So you can download that file as a simple file and complete it offline, but the system will not let you submit any returns until your entity's been approved, and that includes nil returns. If it's been a very, very long time and you're still not getting approved, it's advisable to contact the regulator, something that might have slipped down the radar, or maybe they have some additional questions. We expect approval to be relatively quick. You know, they'll be working very, very hard to do that in the beginning. As soon as the system goes live, as you can imagine, there'll be many applications, so the authority will try and get through them as quick as possible. But I think if it's an extended period of time, definitely worth asking the question. Yeah, so as soon as something's been submitted, an email notification, you'll receive that, and that will show the details of the entity, acknowledging that your application's gone in. Once it's been approved or rejected, you also get another email. So you should just keep an eye on the emails, and that should keep you relatively up to date in terms of what's happening. I think I've already gone through this, so I think Maha also explained a bit more around why someone perhaps might get rejected. So I'm proposing to actually just skip this slide. Okay, data submission. I think this is where it gets a bit more detailed. Now there's two. So if you're a nil return filer, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, it's just check the box. There's a couple of disclaimers and you're done. Maker does that, checker approves it, and your submission's completed. Where it gets a bit more complicated is the actual data filing. So where you have account holders that need to file data. Now, the Ministry of Finance has decided to keep this in Excel, primarily because it's easy to use for large firms and small firms. And the Excel template will be published in the portal. Now, the second part of today, we're going to go through the Excel template that's not available to the public at the moment. The ADGM has it from the Ministry of Finance. But as soon as the system goes live, the Excel file will be accessible by everyone. You'll be able to download it. The Excel file effectively is similar to last year, but it's not exactly the same. It's effectively the same fields and the same data types, but there's additional validations, and we'll go into some of those. The validations are quite substantial around things like TINs. So if you're reporting data on your customers, the solution will check for TINs, check whether those TINs are valid. If they're not valid, it will give you warnings, and there may be then a follow-up by the ADGM on your data. So there should be a massive push by all of you to make sure your data is accurate, complete before submitting it. There'll also be errors for things which are wrong in the file. So errors effectively are issues in data input. Not so relevant here, but there's quite substantial validations on IBANs, ISINs, date of birth, account opening dates, undocumented accounts, etc. If any of that kind of looks wrong, there's a validation which will run in the solution, and you will simply not be able to report. So it'll stop you from reporting. You may get things like warnings for TINs, are slightly different. A warning will allow you to progress, but it will inform you that there's something wrong with your filing. So the OECD for CRS effectively has published the TIN guidance for around about 100 countries, and the solution will be looking at the TIN, the tax identification number you're reporting, and it will check whether it meets those requirements or not. If your filing doesn't meet those requirements, the solution will tell you that, but it will only give you a warning. That might be the only piece of data you have on your account holder, so it'll let you report it. But it will tell you there's a problem, and it's likely you're going to have some kind of follow-up actions with the ministry or the ADGM around the format of the TIN and why it's not complete. So the ADGM will certainly be looking at evidence that you've tried to obtain the right TIN. And look, I mean, the main purpose of this is because the focus when the UAE exchanges this data is to make sure the other tax administrations are able to make sense of it. And if your TIN's wrong, they're not able to make sense of the data and it's effectively useless. So there's a big push around making sure that TIN, tax identification number, or functional equivalent is at least the right format, but at least the right document. Now, I think we're going to see a lot more of this going forward. And it's difficult because each country has a different requirement around TIN. I mean, I'm from the UK. The United Kingdom doesn't really have a tax identification number for individuals. It has a national insurance number. National insurance number is of a certain format. And when an institution reports my data, they need to make sure it's of that format and it's the correct number before it's exchanged. So there's a big push around that, and we'll see more of that from the ministry. Again, it needs to go through making and checking. So if the maker simply submits, that's not a filing, according to the ministry. It's a missed filing if you don't check it and approve it in the system. And then, yeah, submitting nil returns, that's pretty straightforward. You just tick for the entities you want to submit. I think you can do several all in one go. You submit that and you'll get an email notification and it will show in the system your nil submission is done. Again, maker checker still applies. I think I went through this. For those who are going to be uploading lots of data, the errors will come in a full error report. Now, according to the Ministry of Finance, you may have lots of errors in a file. They may not all come up in one go, so you might need to correct some, re-upload, and then some others will come. Again, if there's even one error in one data field in your file, you won't be able to submit. You'll have to correct that before submitting. So errors mainly relate to kind of validation of data fields. TINs are already covered, so I'm not going to cover that again. But you can access that, so everyone can access the TIN, the informations around the TIN formats. It's all public on the OECD webpage under the exchange of information, where a lot of jurisdictions are covered, not all of them are covered. And it effectively covers the requirements for those jurisdictions on whether TINs are mandatory or optional for individuals and entities, and then what the TIN formats actually are. So, and for some countries, it might be a functional equivalent to a TIN. I think I covered all this as well. So this is just the screens around checking or approving once a maker's submitted something. So again, it kind of needs to just go through that 4i review through the system. So I don't propose to go over this anymore. And then how to know if a submission is successful. So in the system, there's basically a tab called Reports. You navigate to that tab. All of your entities and different obligations will be under that tab. And the system will tell you whether the submission's been successful. Now, successful submission doesn't mean your data makes sense. It just means you've submitted something in a proper manner. It's been properly checked and submitted. So there's various kind of color codes in the system to show users that your submission is done. You don't need to take any further actions unless you're otherwise notified. So it will show all the entities, whether it's FATCA and CRS, have some pedigree details like when it was submitted and by who, etc. But all that information is visible in the system. So definitely once you're done with your filing, checkers approved it, worthwhile going to that tab and just making sure it's all done and complete, then you don't need to worry. As we come to the kind of end of this section, you'll be glad to know some of the other actions in the system. You can retract submissions. So once you've made a submission up to the reporting deadline, you can retract it. So even if the checkers submitted it and approved it all the way up to the reporting deadline, you can retract and submit as many times as you want. So if you think you've submitted and then you've made a mistake or you want to make a change, you can retract that filing in its entirety and you can resubmit it. You can delete RFIs as long as the RFI has not submitted any data. So if you've not made any submissions and a checker hasn't authorized anything, you can effectively delete RFIs and create new ones. You can create RFIs for the same entity again and again, but effectively it's just gonna pile up to the RA for approval, and the ADGM will be able to see duplicates. So duplicate filings will be highlighted to them. So once you've made your filing, just wait until you get a decision from the regulator. And then removing users, changing roles, that's all possible in the system. You can change makers to checkers, checkers to makers, admins to non-admins, et cetera, et cetera. There are obviously certain checks and validations in the systems, so certain users can't change access records for others, but effectively admins should be able to do everything in the system. You can also delete users, add new users, pretty much at any time. And that's it for the first section. I think we're going to take a break. Okay, we're going to break for 15 minutes, and then we'll return and actually go through the exciting Excel reports. So thank you. they need their own wallets and so on. I think the question is, are they financial institutions? Are they financial institutions? Well, I don't know. It depends, right? If they don't see them, because the UAE is not issued any guidance.
But then you need to find out that it's coming to the account and then where it's touching, it's like it's going to a bank. There are a lot of things. I mean, let's be.
No, but I think
But that value comes into the account of the entity, which is used by the end user. So it basically, so again, it's not something that works. The thing is, if it touches the account, you have an application. Then, similarly, because you will go from your end, then the data gets accumulated. But again, the thing is, the final world thing only would be you can have a, any of the consultants get the proper one, because that's the grid.
The last answer.
It's not something, even for me, I'm working for Shabbat. The image on the text.
I think the problem with CRS is there's no people. So even if your account's in, it's still that's the problem.
That's how the regulatory, the AEOI works, right? That's how they understand what is happening in all of these countries. The exchange of information.
I would say so. Better safe than sorry.
And to be a safer side.
How are you doing? We meet every June.
I know. How are you? Still in the UAE, yeah?
I'm going on Saturday for 3 weeks.
Oh, very good. Very good. Good to hear. So I'm finding the session.
That's good. It's really good. I think not really getting it out of
It's not that easy to explain conceptually. It's all new to you guys.
It's really
Trying to break it down.
absolutely. I think it makes it easier for us and the consultants. Is the presentation going to be
Sure. I think that AEOI did publish one. I think they're all probably published. They put the training. They put a detailed training section.
Lucky ones. Not the not ones.
The not lucky one. Yeah, so that'd be fun. I think it's a detail. We did one very good job. We went through the sections.
self-certification for should be something. Thank you very much, Bilal.
No worries.
Are you going home anytime soon?
No, too busy.
You're technically and I'm writing, aren't you?
Bilal, you know Abdul Hamid?
Yeah, we used to work together. He was actually at EY before. When I was with EY, he was with EY.
Yeah, he speaks high about you, man.
Oh, really? I haven't spoken to him for...
Because my brother-in-law, he's a very great friend of him. And they are neighbors in Pakistan also.
Okay.
So right now he's in Qatar, right?
Yeah.
Lastly I spoke to him and he said, you need to speak to Bilal. I'm very kind.
He's a great guy, man. Great guy. Always smiling. And I haven't seen him for a few years, actually, because we used to work at EY before I joined PwC. So this last time I probably would have seen him would have been like 2019, I think, like 4 years ago. So I can't remember what he was doing then. I think, was he in transfer pricing? I can't remember now.
Right now he's in tax.
Is he in tax? I'll get something, yeah, I'll grab a coffee.
Please,
Coffee? Yeah.
On your terms, big sec? Yeah. No.
Come on, just be cool. What's wrong with you?
Just let this one go.
No, man.
I do so much.
I know you do. This is for. No, this is for you.
Don't let everyone here. Come on. There's no way. There's no way. It's just 10 minutes.
Sorry.
Let's do it.
You can be fine. see, if you stand here, you can't see. Can you see?
Not really, but can you like?
You want to use the mic? You can bring it forward.
Can you not open it?
Hmm?
Can you not open it?
Okay, so that's forward. That's fine. Okay, it's okay.
To all those people.
Yeah.
It's good.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Hope the breakfast was good. So we're going into our next session now on the reporting template. So probably just to give some context on this, I mentioned earlier, reporting in the solution is indeed either through a nil return, which you effectively just tick the box and confirm you don't have reportable accounts. That's all kind of covered in the previous section. And this section will cover the annual returns. So those that have annual returns, data to report, that's all through Excel. Now, last year, the system also had Excel. Those familiar with the last year's system. This year, it's also Excel, but there are some changes in the template. It's not exactly the same. There are no new data fields as far as I can remember. So the data fields or the data being collected is exactly the same. But the format of the information being collected and also the validation rules are quite substantially different and enhanced in this new portal. What Tara's going to cover over the next kind of 20 minutes is the FATCA and CRS templates. I think we'll start with the CRS one. We're going to walk through the different tabs and the different fields in those tabs and what are the expectations when it kind of comes to data validation and inputting information to avoid things like errors, warnings, and so on. So without further ado, over to you, Tara.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So this is what the CRS annual report submission template will look like once it's downloaded from the portal. It contains 5 sheets. The CRS reportable account information will be reported in the accounts sheet. If an account has controlling persons that are reportable, then that will need to be contained in the controlling person sheet. There's also a comprehensive description of each of the fields and instructions on how to complete them. That's in the filing instruction sheet. And then finally, there's a sheet that covers the entire list of ISO codes for each of the countries to be reported. So starting with the account sheet, this sheet is divided into different sections. The first section is related to the general account information, including the account number, the account type, the opening date, and the closure date. Now, the account number will depend on the type of, or the account type that has been selected. So there's 5 different account types. For example, if the account type that's been selected is an IBAN, then the account number that needs to be included must be a valid IBAN, and it must meet the requirements. So in this case, it will need to start with the letter AE, and it must contain 23 characters in length. If, for example, the account type that's been selected is an ISIN, then again here, a valid ISIN will need to be included, and it must meet the requirements, which is 12 characters in length. The account opening date is a mandatory field, and if the account has been closed during the reporting period, then the closure date will also need to be completed. It's also mandatory to confirm whether the account is a CRS undocumented account or not. So a true or false value will need to be completed. Undocumented accounts for CRS purposes is only relevant for pre-existing accounts. So if a true value has been indicated here, then the account opening date must be before 1 January 2017. There are also mandatory fields in relation to whether the account has been closed and if it's been dormant during the reporting period. So again here, a true or false value will need to be completed. The next section is around the account holder information. So the account type will either be an individual account or an entity account. If the account is an individual account, then the first name and last name details will need to be completed, as well as the date of birth. If the account holder is an entity account, then the name of the entity will need to be provided, as well as the type of entity. Now there's 3 types of entities that can be selected under CRS. The first one is a passive non-financial entity with 1 or more controlling persons that are reportable. The second entity type is a CRS reportable person, for example, an active entity that is reportable. And the third entity type is a passive non-financial entity that is a CRS reportable person. So this is, for example, a passive entity that is in a reportable jurisdiction that does not have controlling persons. The account holder's address will also need to be completed, so mandatory fields include the country, the city, and the street. Now, if the account is a CRS undocumented account, obviously here the reporting financial institution will not have this information. So instead, for the country, you'll need to report the UAE. The value for the city that needs to be included for undocumented account must be NA for not applicable. And then the value for the street will need to be undocumented. There's also a section around the tax information. So the jurisdiction of tax residence is a mandatory field. For undocumented accounts, the jurisdiction of tax residence that needs to be included is the UAE. And then if the account holder is tax resident in a jurisdiction that automatically issues TINs to its residents, then a tax identification number will need to be completed in the right valid format, along with the TIN issuer country code. And then the final sections is around financial account details. So you'll have the currency, which must always be in USD. And then the balance and payments amounts will need to be included. So these amounts need to be non-negative amounts. And then in case account has been closed during the reporting period, then the balance must always be 0. So if an account has a controlling person that is reportable, then the controlling person information will need to be documented in the controlling person sheet. The account number that's included on the controlling person sheet must match the account number that has been reported in the account sheet. Otherwise, an error will be generated. Again, here for controlling persons, the first name, last name, and date of birth are all mandatory fields, as well as the controlling person's address information that includes country, city, and street. Tax jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of tax residence for the controlling person is mandatory. If the controlling person is tax resident in a jurisdiction that issues tax identification numbers to its residents, and that TIN is maintained by the reporting financial institution, then that information will need to be included in the TIN field, along with the TIN issuer country code. And then finally, the last section for controlling persons is the controlling person type. So there's 13 different controlling person types that are aligned with the OECD codes. So for example, if the controlling person is by means of ownership or by means of a senior managing official and so on, that will need to be selected and indicated. So that's it for the CRS annual report submission. The FATCA template is broadly similar, so I won't go through each of the fields in detail. But there is an additional sheet around US TINs. So a description of the US TIN code, the US TIN format is included in this sheet, as well as the list of the TIN codes that the IRS has published in absence of a TIN. Again, this is all broadly similar to CRS. It's the same fields and the same values to complete the fields. If an account holder is an individual account, then they'll need to indicate that the account holder type is individual and complete the first name, last name, and date of birth. If the account holder type is an entity, then the name of the entity will be mandatory, along with the type of the FATCA entity. So for FATCA purposes, there's 4 different entity types. That includes owner-documented FFIs with specified US owners, passive non-financial foreign entities, non-participating FFIs, and specified US person. Now, if the account holder is a US specified person, either as an individual or an entity, then the tax identification number field will be mandatory. So a US TIN must be included for such account holders. In the absence of a US TIN, then you can refer to the US TIN sheet for one of the TIN codes that can be reported in lieu of that. For all other types of entity accounts, then a foreign TIN will need to be reported in the TIN field. In the absence of a foreign TIN, then you can indicate NA for not applicable. And then similar to CRS, the financial account information will need to be reported. So that includes the account balance as well as the payment amounts. So if there are any US controlling persons, again here, this needs to be reported in the substantial owner sheet. The account number, similarly here, will need to link to the account number that's been reported in the account sheet. The substantial owner, first name, last name, and date of birth are all mandatory fields. The substantial owner's address information will need to be completed, so the country, city, and street are all mandatory. And then, of course, the tax identification number here, the US TIN for that US controlling person, will need to be completed in the correct format and structure. So that was it on the sheet, so I'll just leave it open to any questions.
Amount, what needs to mention is gross or net, like receipt minus payment?
Sorry, I didn't
The
get that.
amount, whatever needs to be mentioned is for the period, it's gross amount, like only the payment? Not here, the payment.
The payments?
The amounts, what we need to mention about like withdrawals or like maybe another back, one more back or two or more slides back. Yeah. So like say gross proceeds redemption. It's it.
So, right, the account balance, yeah. What was the question?
Yeah, the gross proceeds, it's like receipt minus payment net amount, or it's only the payments which we should?
It's a net amount.
It's a net amount, okay.
Hi, for virtual assets, MTFs and custodians providing virtual assets are reportable this year or only fiat assets?
Bilal, do you want to take this one?
So for virtual asset, it's still not yet been covered by the OECD as a requirement to be reported. Hopefully they will be issuing a guidance as well as a new requirement for that. Once we receive that through the Ministry of Finance, we will be informing all of the financial institutions.
Thank you.
So regarding balance, it is mentioned for closed accounts, balance immediately before account closure. So I guess that amount should be zero when the account has been closed and it is the amount is mentioned in gross proceeds. Otherwise, amount would be doubled up.
So the amount is the amount before closure. So if it should not be zero. If the account balance is not zero before closure, then you would need to report the actual account balance right before the closure date.
But amount would be same as gross proceeds, which would be reported for account is getting closed.
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
The balance is mentioned as for closed accounts.
Yes.
So the accounts which gets closed, they
Yes.
have the ending balance as 0.
Why it will be 0?
But the account has got closed, the amount has been redeemed.
If the closure letter specify that it's a 0 balance, then you need to report it as a 0 balance.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ahmad, and thanks for the presentation. In terms of the first slide for the CRS reporting, there is one account status which also mentions dormant. So, yeah, is dormant the third, right? Is the account is dormant. So what is the definition of dormant? Because usually some companies have their own policies. So is there any specific timelines for the dormancy?
Yeah, so I think in terms of dormant, so the OECD, sorry, I just need to address this. So the OECD, they have published some guidance on dormant. So if you refer to the OECD standard on CRS, there are some guidelines around dormant. Now, I think basically what it says there is a dormant account is anything that the RFI has determined as dormant, but they do give some minimum standards. So there are some timeframes, for example, 5 years, no contact from the account holder, no transactions, etc., etc. So the OECD has issued some minimum standards on dormancy, and you might have some of your own policies and procedures to go above and beyond their guidelines.
Noted, thank you.
And since we are on this page, undocumented account, let me assure you that none of you maintain any undocumented account.
Yeah, so the definition of an undocumented account by nature is a pre-existing account. So that's an account which must have opened on or before 31st of December 2016, which many of you will not have. It's also an account where you only have an in care of or hold mail address, no current residence address, no current mailing address, etc. So it's intended to notify the OECD about those accounts with kind of severe deficiencies when it comes to AML and KYC. But I think by virtue of the accounts that you all hold are effectively all new accounts in terms of when they were opened. So yeah, you shouldn't have any of those. Any other questions? No. All good? Very good. Anything else, Maha, before we close?
Do you have any question for ADGM? Yes, so basically, I think the Ministry of Finance will be providing us with an email address for the support. So this is the IT people who will go through the system as well. If they do not respond to you, we will advise you to reach out to us at fatca.crs@adgm.com. You can also reach out to me personally on my personal email as well as Greta's email. I think and I believe by now all of you have our email address. Any other question? Yes. Thank you. I will give the closing remarks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, William. So by now we have reached our end of our training today. I hope by now we have addressed any ambiguity or any uncertainty you might have in regard to FATCA and CRS reporting obligation. I would like to emphasize that any non-compliance we might find, we will take it very seriously. We will be conducting an audit for all of the RFI The audit has started last year and it will continue for the next 2 years. Let me assure you that all of the reporting financial institutions will be audited in this period. Should you have any further question, as I said, please reach out to us at fatca.crs@adgm.com. You can also reach out to me personally on my personal email, as well as Greta. We will also publish this document as well as any FAQ in regard to the portal on our website under International Tax Matter, under International Tax Issues, which is under the ADGM website. We also will be providing this training material to be published on our website. The guidance for the portal itself is already published, so you can go there and go through all of these documents. These definitions has already been addressed at the actual Excel sheet that it will be provided at the portal. So when you log into this Excel sheet to report your returns, you can reach out and see all of these definitions and other more. Once again, thank you very much for coming today and engage with us in this training. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bilal, and thank you, PwC.